Good afternoon. Our next presentation will begin immediately. It is going to be FDA rulemaking on gluten-free food labeling, and it will be given by Commander Suzanne Wolcoff. Commander Wolcoff?
Good afternoon. Like Shirley said, I'm a registered dietitian at the Office of Nutrition, Labeling, and Dietary Supplements here at the FDA, and I will be speaking today about FDA's rulemaking on gluten-free food labeling. The focus of my presentation is as follows. First, I will provide an overview of the major legislative and other activities that preceded FDA's rulemaking on gluten-free food labeling. Then I will explain the proposed requirements for foods whose labeling is regulated by FDA and bear a gluten-free claim that are sold in the United States. And lastly, I will discuss the current status of FDA's rulemaking, including factors that the agency will consider when developing a final rule to define the term gluten-free. But first, we're going to take a poll on what you know concerning gluten. Which grain would be prohibited on a gluten-free diet? A, wheat, B, triticale, C, rye, D, barley, or E, all of the above. We'll come back to the answer in a few minutes. So let's discuss some of the events that preceded the FDA's gluten-free food labeling rulemaking. A law called the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004, known as FALPA, was directed by the Secretary of Health and Human Services to undertake rulemaking to define and permit the use of the food labeling term gluten-free. FDA is serving as the Secretary's designee to comply with this mandate. It is considering persons with celiac disease to be the primary target population to benefit from this rulemaking. Similar to food allergies, celiac disease has no cure. Dietary avoidance of gluten is the only way to prevent the harmful health effects of this disease. The term gluten is commonly used to collectively refer to particular proteins that naturally occur in certain grains that can cause damage to the lining of the small intestine, as well as adversely affect other organs of the body when consumed by persons with celiac disease. Preceding this rulemaking, FDA reviewed the scientific literature about the association between gluten intake and celiac disease. Because there is no consensus opinion among medical experts about what the term gluten-free should mean, in June 2005, agency staff drafted a report entitled Approaches to Establish Thresholds for Major Food Allergens and for Gluten in Food, which is referred to as the Thresholds Report. This report identified 4 possible approaches that FDA could consider to establish a gluten threshold level as a criterion to define the term gluten-free. In July 2005, FDA held a public meeting of its Food Advisory Committee that reviewed the draft thresholds report and concluded that it was scientifically sound. FDA issued a revised thresholds report in March 2006 to address comments it received from committee members and the public. In August 2005, FDA held another meeting to open to the public and invited speakers to address different questions published in a related Federal Register notice that solicited comments. These questions concern the manufacturing of gluten-free foods, consumer purchasing practices and views about gluten-free foods, and analytical methods designed to detect gluten in foods. So what are the approaches to establish a gluten threshold level? Using an analytical methods-based approach, a gluten threshold level is determined by the ability or sensitivity of an analytical method designed to detect gluten that is used to verify compliance of a food with a gluten-free standard. Using a safety assessment-based approach, a gluten threshold considered to be safe or well tolerated by persons with celiac disease is actually calculated based upon data derived from controlled gluten exposure studies that report no or the lowest observed adverse effect levels. Similar to a safety assessment, a risk assessment also examines the data published in the scientific literature to try to quantify both the levels of risk to persons with celiac disease associated with consuming different amounts of gluten and the degree of uncertainty in the risk estimate. For example, a risk assessment might estimate that there is 95% certainty that 90% of the individuals with celiac disease can tolerate X amount of gluten without causing them harm. Lastly, a statutory-derived approach would consider information or provisions in a law that could be extrapolated to develop a gluten threshold level in the context of celiac disease. The Thresholds report concluded that the only two feasible approaches to establish a gluten threshold level are those based on analytical methods or a safety assessment. The FDA published a proposed rule to define the term gluten-free on January 23, 2007, which provided a 90-day comment period that ended on April 23, 2007. On the same day the proposal was issued, we posted at our website a series of questions and answers that explains the rule's major provisions. FDA received about 750 public comments in response to this proposal. So here is the results of our first poll. Let's see how many got this question right. Very good, 94%. And we're going to get into the definition here next, so you'll be able to see if you got it wrong. FDA proposed to define the term prohibited grain to mean the following. Wheat, which is any species of grain belonging to the genus Triticum. Rye, which is any species of grain belonging to the genus Cicale. Barley, which is any species of grain belonging to the genus Hordeum, or any crossbred hybrid of these three grains. For example, Triticale is a cross between wheat and rye. FDA proposed to define the term gluten to mean the protein that naturally occurs in a prohibited grain and that may cause adverse health effects in persons with celiac disease. We cited examples of two categories of such proteins, prolamins and glutenins, that have been reported in the scientific literature to be problematic for persons with celiac disease. FDA proposed to define a gluten-free food to mean a food that cannot contain any one of the following. Ingredients that are a prohibited grain, for example, spelt wheat, or ingredients derived from a prohibited grain that have not been processed to remove gluten. In this example, that would be wheat flour. Or ingredients derived from a prohibited grain that have been processed to remove gluten, for example, wheat starch, if the use of that ingredient results in the presence of 20 parts per million or more gluten in the finished food, or 20 parts per million or more gluten. FDA used the analytical methods-based approach to establish a 20 parts per million gluten threshold level as one of the criteria to define gluten-free. This approach represents one of the two identified in the Thresholds report that was deemed feasible. FDA also discussed in the proposal that the agency has tentatively determined that enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay or ELISA-based methods can be used reliably and consistently to detect gluten at the level of 20 parts per million or more in a variety of foods, including those that are raw, cooked, and baked. To FDA's knowledge, 20 parts per million is currently the lowest level at which an ELISA-based method to detect gluten has been validated, where the results have been published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. As a regulatory agency, FDA routinely uses validated methods when we analyze products for compliance with our labeling and other requirements. The proposed rule addresses requirements for all FDA-regulated foods marketed in the U.S., which include those domestically produced and imported that bear a gluten-free or similar labeling claim. For example, claims that state free of gluten, without gluten, no gluten, or otherwise imply the absence of gluten would be covered by the provisions in our proposed rule. FDA proposed that a food that bears a gluten-free or similar labeling claim will be deemed misbranded if any one of the following three criteria apply. the food does not comply with the definition of gluten-free that I just described, or with the exception of a food made from oats, the gluten-free labeling claim for a food, like milk, that is inherently free of gluten does not refer to all foods of the same type. Examples of an appropriate gluten-free claim made for milk would be milk, a gluten-free food, and all milk is gluten-free. A gluten-free labeled food also would be misbranded if it contains 20 parts per million or more gluten. In contrast, FDA proposed that a food made from oats that bears a gluten-free or similar labeling claim would be deemed misbranded if the claim refers to all foods of the same type. This means that FDA proposed to prohibit a labeling claim saying that all oats are gluten-free. FDA further proposed that a food made from oats bearing a gluten-free labeling claim will be deemed misbranded if it contains 20 parts per million or more gluten. The reason why FDA proposed to prohibit labels of foods made with oats from stating or implying that all oats are gluten-free is because documentation in the scientific literature indicates that commercially available oats typically contain gluten from wheat, rye, or barley. This presence of gluten may be due to the commingling of other grains with oats during any step of the farm-to-table continuum. This proposed provision is intended to assist persons with celiac disease to easily identify oats without gluten contamination by looking for a gluten-free claim on the label. Since 2007, when the proposed rule was issued, other articles have been published in the scientific literature, indicating that the problem of gluten cross-contact is not limited to just oats, that other grains and flours inherently free of gluten could contain gluten from wheat, rye, or barley. Therefore, this newer information will inform FDA's thinking when developing a final rule. The preamble of our proposal explains that a determination of whether a food labeled gluten-free complies with an established definition of gluten-free could be based upon the use of a number of techniques, such as a food label review, or on-site inspections of food manufacturers, or an analysis of food samples. However, when compliance is based upon an analysis of the food, the proposed rule stated that FDA would use a method that can reliably detect the presence of 20 parts per million gluten in a variety of matrices, including raw and cooked or baked products. As I stated previously, a safety assessment-based approach was the other of two approaches identified in the threshold report as being feasible to establish a gluten threshold level. Toxicologists within FDA's Office of Food Safety were the lead staff responsible for conducting the safety assessment of gluten exposure in individuals with celiac disease, which was encompassed within a broader health hazard assessment. They prepared the report entitled Health Hazard Assessment for Effects of Gluten Exposure in Individuals with Celiac Disease, Determination of Tolerable Daily Intake Levels and Levels of Concern for Gluten. The gluten report underwent a peer review of experts outside of FDA and was revised as appropriate, considering their comments. Copies of the 2010 peer review report and the 2011 gluten report can be accessed at FDA's website. On August 3, 2011, FDA published a Federal Register notice that announced the availability of and solicited public comments on the gluten report and on a number of specific issues about defining the term gluten-free. This notice provided a 60-day comment period which closed on October 3rd. The day before this notice was published, FDA did the following as a way to alert the public about the upcoming notice. We held a stakeholders conference call. We posted a series of questions and answers about the Federal Register notice at our website, and we issued a news release and related FDA consumer update, which are also posted at our website. Our Federal Register notice provides a brief overview of the safety assessment's key findings. However, one would have to carefully read the gluten report in its entirety for a complete explanation of how the safety assessment was conducted, the types of data considered, the assumptions made, and the interpretation of findings. As explained in the Federal Register notice, FDA has tentatively concluded that it will use an analytical methods-based approach to set a gluten threshold level of less than 20 parts per million as one of the criteria to define the term gluten-free. Second, the agency has tentatively concluded that use of a safety assessment-based approach to set a gluten threshold level may lead to a conservative and highly uncertain estimation of risks to persons with celiac disease associated with very low levels of gluten. Thirdly, FDA has tentatively concluded that it will use and specify in codified language in the final rule the particular analytical methods the agency will use in its enforcement program for gluten-free claims. FDA is considering using a combination of these two methods that were discussed in the proposed rule as a way to decrease the probability of any false positives or negatives and to increase the confidence level of conclusions based on these results. One of these methods was validated in Europe and is commonly referred to as the ELISA R5 Mendes method. This is the same method recommended by the Codex Alimentarius Commission for Gluten Detection in a Food. The other method FDA is considering using in its enforcement program is one of two ELISA-based methods validated in Japan and adopted as an official method of the Japanese government. FDA refers to this method as the Moringa method. As noted both in the thresholds report and in the proposed rule, the establishment of a gluten threshold may require FDA to consider other factors as well, such as ease of compliance and enforcement of the definition of gluten-free, stakeholder concerns, including those of consumers who have celiac disease, manufacturers of gluten-free foods, and other interested parties. Economics, considering the economic impact of both the food industry and consumers. Trade issues related to U.S. foreign trading partners. And legal authorities or provisions that exist under the laws FDA enforces. Now let's take another poll. FDA defines free in relation to nutrient content claims as 0. True or false? The Federal Register notice provides FDA rationale for using an analytical methods-based approach to establish a gluten threshold level to define the term gluten-free. One of the reasons is that less than 20 parts per million gluten is consistent with international standards, based upon Codex's definition of gluten-free that are adopted by 27 countries in Europe. Another reason is the less than 20 parts per million gluten is consistent with the statements and some epidemiologic evidence reported in the scientific literature that suggests that the trace amount of gluten that persons with celiac disease can safely tolerate is variable, and that less than 20 parts per million falls within this range. Further, to FDA's knowledge, analytical methods have not been validated to consistently and reliably detect gluten at levels less than 20 parts per million. Other reasons supporting FDA's use of an analytical methods-based approach to set a less than 20 parts per million threshold level is the agency's uncertainty about manufacturers of multi-ingredient foods, especially grain-based products, to meet a lower gluten threshold level. We are unsure of the possible unintended consequences adopting a lower gluten threshold level may have, such as if it would make it more difficult or costly for those with celiac disease to adhere lifelong to a gluten-free diet. If there is an increase in the prevalence of persons with celiac disease not adhering to a gluten-free diet, they could actually be placed at higher risk for developing serious health complications and other diseases associated with celiac disease. If FDA could indeed enforce a gluten threshold level lower than less than 20 parts per million, the agency questions whether this would influence some U.S. food manufacturers to discontinue labeling their products gluten-free because they cannot consistently meet a lower gluten level, discourage other U.S. food companies from becoming new manufacturers of products labeled gluten-free, result in a significant increase in the cost to both the consumer and manufacturer of foods labeled gluten-free, and/or negatively impact international trade of foods labeled gluten-free, thereby affecting the availability of certain foods to persons with celiac disease residing in the United States. So, according to your poll answers, 99% chose false, which is correct. Very good. Specific issues identified in the Federal Register notice, which FDA sought public comments or data and other supporting information, include whether and how the safety assessment should affect the definition of gluten-free in the final rule, the conduct and content of our safety assessment, and the research studies and epidemiologic evidence reported in the scientific literature, but were not factored into the safety assessment analysis. FDA also sought feedback on the agency's tentative decisions to use less than 20 parts per million gluten as a criterion for defining the term gluten-free, and to use and codify in the final rule the proposed ELISA R5 Mendes method and the Moringa method as the two methods FDA would use in conjunction with one another to enforce the definition of gluten-free. The Federal Register notice also asks whether, in light of FDA's findings in the safety assessment, the presence of greater than 0.01 parts per million but less than 20 parts per million gluten in foods labeled gluten-free is a material fact which requires label disclosure to be truthful and not misleading. And if a material fact, what type of qualifying language should be included on the label to inform persons with celiac disease that the food bearing a gluten-free claim could contain the amount of gluten permitted by a gluten threshold established by FDA in the final rule. Currently, there is precedent in FDA regulations on defined free nutrient content claims that allow up to a certain measurable amount of a substance that is the subject of that free claim to be in the food. For example, a fat-free food could contain less than 0.5 grams of fat. A sodium-free food could contain less than 5 milligrams of sodium, and a cholesterol-free food could contain less than 2 milligrams of cholesterol. However, FDA does not require these claims to be accompanied by any qualifying statements on the label explaining that the term free does not mean zero. If the presence of some trace amount of gluten is considered to be material fact, FDA asked how should any qualifying language included on the food label be worded for a gluten-free claim to be truthful and not misleading, and where should it be located on the food label. And here are some examples of how we would do that. Place an asterisk immediately after the term gluten-free. Should the term gluten-free after the asterisk be accompanied by some information? And should any statement be located in close proximity to the gluten-free claim in a particular print size? Related to the material fact issue, FDA sought comments on the proportion of the celiac disease population that may experience adverse health effects from exposure to gluten at levels between 0.01 parts per million and less than 20 parts per million. If commenters believe that a low gluten claim would be helpful, we asked how much gluten could a food labeled low gluten contain, and asked if there were other criteria a food bearing a low gluten claim should meet. Finally, FDA invited comment on other data or other information not already identified in the Federal Register notice, gluten report, or proposed rule that FDA should consider to establish a gluten threshold level to define the term gluten-free. FDA's overall position on defining the term gluten-free, as stated in the Federal Register notice, the agency will remain open to the feasibility and desirability of revising the gluten threshold level that is adopted in a final rule to define the term gluten-free, considering the following: the availability of more sensitive analytical methods that can detect gluten, and further research on celiac disease in the future that indicates that use of a lower gluten threshold level is warranted to be adequately protective of the celiac disease population. I just want to emphasize that it is FDA's primary goal in its rulemaking to define the term gluten-free in a way that protects the vast majority of persons with celiac disease without unnecessarily restricting their food choices or making it more difficult or costly for them to adhere lifelong to a gluten-free diet. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Commander Wolcoff. I see we have quite a few questions that came in while you were speaking, and I'm going to take those questions from the very beginning, the ones that came in. The first question is there any market testing on gluten-free approved products? Traditional vanilla extract is distilled from grain alcohol and therefore is a glutinous product. How will the compliance be kept accountable?
Well, since the final rule has not been passed, currently if something is labeled gluten-free, the FDA is viewing that as truthful and not misleading. We do encourage people to always check with the manufacturer if they do have concerns, especially if they have celiac disease. But again, the purpose of this rulemaking is so we can have some criteria where we can actually analyze the products and make sure that what they are putting on there is correct.
All right, our next question is, when will the final rule be published on gluten-free labeling? And does FDA take action currently on gluten-free labeling?
Well, we don't really have control over when the final rule will go through, but I think that there's hopes that it will be this year, but I can't speak to that. As far as what is put on labels now and how we use compliance for that, again, if it's brought to our attention, usually a lot of products are labeled gluten-free and the manufacturer may not know that, for instance, spelt, contains gluten. So it's pretty obvious. Other ways is just, when we do our inspections, we may find presence of gluten being used in the manufacture of the food.
All right, we have time for one more question, and that question is it had to do with gluten-free foods in restaurants. Will the term gluten-free be enforced with restaurant food?
Currently, I don't have an answer for that. Again, this is something that has not passed yet, and we don't know the extent of how it will be used. But certainly, if that's something that someone feels strongly about, we encourage you to let us know.
We do have later today a topic on menu labeling in restaurants, so that may be some additional information on this issue. So thank you again, Commander Wolcoff.